firing upon a ship full of baby food. In other words, he really believed that any ships that had any missiles had already turned around, and they didn't think they should confront these two that were still on their way. Well, military leaders were not very pleased with Secretary McNamara's recommendation or President Kennedy's decision to take his recommendation. Once the quarantine action proved effective, President Kennedy initiated two more demands upon Premier Khrushchev and the Soviet Union. What would those demands be, do you think, once he got the ship stopped? What's his two demands now to Russia? Remove those missiles that are already there and dismantle those missile launching pads that would allow them to be operational. So he asked the missiles presently in Cuba to be removed and the construction sites be destroyed as well.
How do we verify it?
What's that?
How about the verification?
Do it at YouTube. They're going to continue these YouTube things.
No on ground?
I think he's trying to he's staying away from any of that. Well, tension mounts as President Kennedy receives a reply from his earlier letter. Remember the first letter he sent to him asking him if he was the same man? So he gets the letter that he sent Monday. This is a response he gets from Khrushchev. I have not assumed that you or any other sane man would in this nuclear age deliberately plunge the world into a war in which it is crystal clear no country could win and which could only result in a catastrophic consequence to the whole world. This was Khrushchev's response to that. You, Mr. President, are not declaring a quarantine, but rather are setting forth an ultimatum and threatening that if we do not give in to your demands, you will use force. Consider what you are saying. You are no longer appealing to reason, but wish to intimidate us. That was the response he got back from Khrushchev. Well, things got worse for President Kennedy when SAC, or Strategic Air Command, moved the nation from DEFCON 3 to DEFCON 2 without even telling him. They didn't tell him. Now, President Kennedy was furious, and he responded in an angry manner about the situation to Joint Chiefs Chairman General Maxwell Taylor, who actually was a very good friend of his. But he was mad, and General Taylor informed President Kennedy that SAC had the authority to move to DEFCON 2, and the President again responded, which they actually did have that authority, but wasn't bright not to tell the President. And when Taylor tells Kennedy that they have the authority to move to DEFCON 2, he yells at him and he says, I have the authority, I'm the Commander-in-Chief of the United States, and I say when we go to war. Well, Maxwell Taylor didn't learn his lesson, and he responded back to Kennedy, we're not at war, sir, not until DEFCON 1. And Kennedy was very blunt. He said, General, the Joint Chiefs have just signaled our intent to escalate to the Soviet Union. You signaled an escalation that I did not wish to signal and which I did not approve. And he basically just dismissed him angrily and said, get out of here, Max. Kicked him out of the office. Well, the President was very, very frustrated, and he even asked Kenneth O'Donnell to give him some alone time with Bobby. And O'Donnell left the office, and Bobby and President Kennedy sat there and visited. Well, the two decided they were going to leak information through the press to a journalist by the name of Walter Lippmann. And this leak would include rumors that the United States, believe it or not, might be interested in pulling their missiles from Turkey in exchange for the Soviets removing those in Cuba. Something that Adlai Stevenson had suggested way back that they thought was absolutely crazy to do. And that's kind of how Wednesday, October 24th ended, was the Kennedy brothers leaking something to the press, okay? Trying to get some negotiation going. Because whether you know this or not, the military was pressing Khrushchev just as hard as they were pressing Kennedy on our side. Both militaries wanted to go to war. Well, on Thursday, October 25th, President Kennedy started the day by writing a letter to Orville Dreyfus, thanking him for agreeing not to print certain information about the confrontation with the Soviet Union over Cuba. And he wrote in his letter, an important service to the national interest was performed by your agreement to withhold information that was available to you Sunday afternoon. So he really wrote him a personal note thanking him for not leaking that, or not leaking, but putting that story out prior to Monday. For Kenneth O'Donnell, the morning didn't start out so great. It started out with confrontation. What happened is National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy informed O'Donnell how upset the military was over this leak about the missiles in Turkey. So they actually did leak that information to the press that the United States, not saying who, not where the leak came from, might be interested in trading our nuclear missiles in Turkey for the ones in Cuba. And the military was furious. And Bundy explains to O'Donnell, he says, they know it was Jack and Bobby behind the leak, and they're furious. The military knew those two leaked it out. And this statement really made O'Donnell angry because it implies to Bundy that he should refer to them as the President and the Attorney General, not Jack and Bobby. Although McGeorge Bundy was friends with the Kennedys, as soon as he said that, Kenneth O'Donnell snapped back. You mean the President, the Attorney General? And then he goes on to chew him out a little bit. First of all, O'Donnell sits there and listens, and McGeorge Bundy says, you got to stop it. You need to talk to them. They will listen to you. This is what McGeorge Bundy's trying to get O'Donnell. And then Bundy went on to say, you know that Jack and Bobby lack a moral toughness. And that's when O'Donnell really got angry, and he informed Bundy that his loyalty was in question, that he wouldn't be in the White House if it wasn't for the Kennedys. Well, I mean, how disloyal can you be? Well, after his exchange of words with McGeorge Bundy, O'Donnell actually met with President Kennedy and expressed his own displeasure about the decision to leak the information. And O'Donnell told the president that there would be only one way the world would look at the leak, that the United States was selling out their allies for their own safety, because this thing in Cuba is not only going to affect the United States, it's going to affect the entire Western Hemisphere. Well, anyway, at this point in the day, the Security Council of the United Nations was meeting to discuss the events in Cuba, and many members of the United Nations around the world were questioning the United States' position on the issue of Cuba. And so at the United Nations, the United States is going to need to justify to other countries around the world their actions towards the Soviet Union and Cuba. Well, Press Secretary Salinger urges the President to make arrangements for Commander Ecker's photographs of the missile sites to be furnished to UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson, because the UN hasn't seen these. And the Russians continue to deny that there are any missiles or missile launching pads in Cuba. So Press Secretary Salinger is saying, hey, send in Adlai Stevenson with these photos and let's show the United Nations what's up. Well, Ambassador Stevenson would be the person responsible to convince members of the UN Security Council that the United States was justified in their actions with Cuba. Well, many people in the Kennedy administration, especially Bobby, had serious doubts that Stevenson had what it would take to get UN support for the United Nations, because Soviet Ambassador V.A. Zorin was very much a hardliner, and many thought Stevenson was too weak to stand up in front of him in the United Nations. Didn't think he had the moxie. And Bobby wanted his brother to pull Stevenson and replace him with someone who could handle that Soviet ambassador, because he was tough, and Adlai was viewed a little bit as wimpy, to be quite frank with you. Well, President Kennedy disagreed with Bobby, and he again called Kenneth O'Donnell. He says, hey, you call Adlai Stevenson, you give him a little bit of a pep talk before he goes in there with V.A. Zorin. And so here's the conversation between O'Donnell and Stevenson on the telephone. Kenneth O'Donnell says, Adlai, the world has to know we're right. If we're going to have a chance on a political solution, we're going to need some international pressure. You got to be tough, Adlai. You got to find it, buddy. And Stevenson says, I'm an old political cat, Kenny. I think I've got one life left. And O'Donnell says, I know you do. So anyway, Ambassador Stevenson goes back into the UN meeting. He's a little bit late, and he aggressively confronts Soviet Ambassador Zorin. Now this would be this information I have here under the brilliance of Adlai Stevenson. This was the conversation. Did you get where you didn't go? This was the conversation that Stevenson had with Zorin, and nobody really thought he had a shot. Matter of fact, Bobby Kennedy was on the phone just waiting if Stevenson went south to pull him and bring somebody else in. But anyway, here's how it comes in. Stevenson comes in late. Zorin says, of course they have interpreters because they have the things on their ears that translate. He says, we are very glad you could join us, Mr. Stevenson. For the last 2 hours, the entire world is asking only questions. The United States is pushing the entire world to the brink of catastrophe. The people of the world want to know why. We are told again and again about some incontrovertible evidence of offensive weapons to Cuba. but no evidence can be shown to us. Perhaps your spy planes are so secret that you're simply incapable to present such evidence. Perhaps the United States of America is simply mistaken. Huh? The chair now recognizes the representative from the United States. Stevenson sets up. Well, let me say something to you, Mr. Ambassador. We do have the evidence. We have it, and it is clear and incontrovertible. Let me say something else. These weapons must be taken out of Cuba. You, the Soviet Union, have created this danger, this new danger, not the United States. Finally, Mr. Zorn, I remind you that the other day you did not deny the existence of these weapons, but today again, if I've heard you correctly, you now say they do not exist or that we haven't proved they exist. All right, sir, let me ask you one simple question. Do you, Ambassador Zorn, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sites in Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation. Yes or no? Zorn responds by saying, I am not in an American courtroom, sir, and therefore I do not wish to answer a question that is put to me in the fashion in which a prosecutor puts questions. In due course, sir, you will have your answer. Stevenson responds, you are in the courtroom of world opinion right now, and you can answer yes or no. You have denied that they existed, and I want to know whether I have understood you correctly. Zorn says, continue with your statement. You will have your answer in due course. Stevenson says, I am prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision. And I am also prepared to present the evidence in this room. The Soviet Union has lied to the world. Zorn responds, if you have decided not to continue your statement, the chair recognizes a representative from Chile, because they all have a chance to talk. And the representative from Chile, who's quite interested in this conversation, promptly gives his time back to Adlai Stevenson in the United States, and with that Stevenson reveals the photographs of the Russian missiles and missile sites in Cuba. So the United States now is going to have the support from the United Nations they desperately need. Okay? Now, I don't know what you want to do here. We got time. If you want to, we've gone about an hour. We could watch this video 13 days up to this point and kind of see what I'm talking about, if that's something that you would like to do. And then next time we'll kind of finish up with Friday and finish up the rest. Would you like to do that? So, okay, so we'll watch the video. I will send a copy, Candace, home with you. I think you'll enjoy this. It's pretty good. Some of you maybe have seen it. I will send that home with you. Well, let's watch this a little bit. I think you'll enjoy it. It's pretty good, and it'll kind of take us up to this point. Anybody got to go to the bathroom or something?
Yes, I do.
Well, you go right ahead. If you guys want to run to the restroom while I gear this thing up, you could. Have you ever seen this, Hannah? Hey, Jim, you get the light for me, dear. I can't see this keyboard. There. I think this will probably explain to you or give you as good a lecture as I can give you when you see it. I really like to show this to the kids because it's very, very good.